Is on. Mira,
Hello, and welcome to the 3rd and 4th grade ELA night. Tonight we'll be reading The Polar Express. On Christmas Eve, many years ago, I lay quietly in my bed. I did not rustle the sheets. I breathed slowly and silently. I was listening for a sound a friend had told me. I'd never hear the ringing bells of Santa's sleigh. There is no Santa, my friend had insisted, but I knew he was wrong. Late that night I did hear sounds, though not of ringing bells. From outside came the sounds of hissing steam and squeaking metal. I looked through my window and saw a train standing perfectly still in front of my house. It was wrapped in an apron of steam. Snowflakes fell lightly around it. A conductor stood at the open door of one of the cars. He took a large pocket, watch from his vest, then looked up at my window. I put on my slippers and robe. I tiptoed downstairs and out the door. All aboard! The conductor cried out. I ran up to him. Well, he said, are you coming? Where? I asked. Why, to the North Pole, of course, was his answer. This is the Polar Express. I took the outstretched hand and he pulled me aboard. The train was filled with other children, all in their pajamas and nightgowns. We sang Christmas carols and ate candies with nugget centers as white as snow. We drank hot cocoa as thick and rich as melted chocolate bars. Outside, the lights of towns and villages flickered in the distance as the Polar Express raced forthward. Soon there were no more lights to be seen. We traveled through cold, dark forests, where lean wolves roamed and white-tailed rabbits hid from our train as it thundered through the quiet wilderness. We climbed mountains so high it seemed as if we would scrape the moon, but the Polar Express never slowed down. Faster and faster we ran along, rolling over peaks and through valleys like a car on a roller coaster. The mountains turned into hills, the hills to snow-covered plains. We crossed a barren desert of ice, the great polar ice cap. Lights appeared in the distance. They looked like the lights of a strange ocean liner sailing on a frozen sea. There, said the conductor, is the North Pole. The North Pole. It was a huge city standing alone at the top of the world, filled with factories where every Christmas toy was made. At first, we saw no elves. They are gathering at the center of the city. The conductor told us, that is where Santa will give the first gift of Christmas. Who receives the first gift? We all asked. The conductor answered, he will choose one of you. Look, shouted one of the children, the elves! Outside we saw hundreds of elves. As our train drew closer to the center of the North Pole, we slowed to a crawl. So crowded were the streets with Santa helpers. When the Polar Express could go no farther, we stopped and the conductor let us out. We pressed through the crowd to the edge of a large open circle. In front of us stood Santa's sleigh. The reindeer were excited. They pranced and paced, ringing the silver bells that hung from their harnesses. It was a magical sound, like nothing I'd ever heard. Across the circle, the elves moved apart, and Santa Claus appeared. The elves chilled wildly. He marched over to us and pointed to me and said, "Let's have this fellow here." He jumped into his sleigh. The conductor handed me up. I sat on Santa's knee and he asked, "Now what would you like for Christmas?" I knew that I could have any gift I could imagine, but the thing I wanted most for Christmas was not inside Santa's giant bag. What I wanted more than anything was one silver bell from Santa's sleigh. When I asked, Santa smiled. Then he gave me a hug and told an elf to cut a bell from a reindeer's harness. The elf tossed it up to Santa. He stood holding the bell high above him and called out, "The first gift of Christmas!" A clock struck midnight as the elves roared their approval. Santa handed the bell to me, and I put it in my bathrobe pocket. The conductor held me down from the sleigh. Santa shouted out the reindeers' names and cracked his whip. His team charged forward and climbed into the air. Santa circled once above us, then disappeared in the cold, dark polar sky. As soon as we were back inside the Polar Express, the other children asked to see the bell. I reached into my pocket, but the only thing I felt was a hole. I had lost the silver bell from Santa Claus's sleigh. "Let's hurry outside and look for it," one of the children said. But the train gave a sudden lurch and started moving. We were on our way home. It broke my heart to lose the bell. When the train reached my house, I sadly left the other children. I stood at my doorway and waved goodbye. The conductor said something from the moving train, but I couldn't hear him. "What?" I yelled out. He cupped his hands around his mouth. "Merry Christmas!" he shouted. The Polar Express let out a loud blast from its whistle and sped away. On Christmas morning, my little sister Sarah and I opened our presents. When it looked as if everything had been unwrapped, Sarah found one last small box behind the tree. It had my name on it. Inside was the silver bell. There was a note. "Found this on the seat of my sleigh. Fix that hole in your pocket. Signed, Mr. C." I shook the bell. It made the most beautiful sound my sister and I had ever heard. But my mother said, "Oh, that's too bad." "Yes," said my father, "it's broken." When I'd shaken the bell, my parents had not heard a sound. At one time, most of my friends could hear the bell, but as years passed, it fell silent for all of them. Even Sarah found one Christmas that she could no longer hear its sweet sound. Though I've grown old, the bell still rings for me, as it does for all who truly believe. All right, Ms. Claydair, what were some questions that you could ask our students about our book, The Polar Express?
We thank you, students and parents, for listening to Mrs. Claus read Polar Express. To reflect on the story, to see how good we were listening, I'm going to ask some questions, kind of like what you hear in your third, and fourth grade ELA classes that you're asked. In reflection of the story, how are the main character and his sister, Sarah, similar in the story The Polar Express? Think. How are they the same? Yeah. What are some details from the story that can help you prove that they are the same? Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Now, how are the children and the parents in the story different?
Hmm.
Hmm. How are the parents different from the children in the story, The Polar Express? Yeah. That's too bad. What are some other details that might prove that the parents were different from the children? That's some good evidence. Very good. After listening to the Polar Express, you might hear the author use something called non-literal text, which we know is figurative language, right? Yeah. Can you listen and find a sentence from the story that has figurative language? Is it Santa disappeared into the cold, dark polar sky? Is it the elves moved apart and Santa Claus appeared? Is it that they climbed so high it seemed as if we would scrape the moon? Snowflakes, or is it snowflakes fell silently around the Polar Express? Hmm. Which one is a figure of speech? Something that we found a little unusual to express. That's it. What do you think the author means literally when he used that phrase? We climb mountains so high it seems as if we would scrape the moon. Hmm. Yes.
Yes, that was good.
Now let's talk about some events that went through the story. If you think back to the beginning of the story when they were on their way to the North Pole, which of these things do you think happened first when they were on their way to the North Pole? Did they sing Christmas carols and eat candy nuggets that had centers as white as snow? Or did they climb mountains so high we scraped the moon and we rode through the valleys like a core on a roller coaster? What happened first when they got on the boat? Yeah, good job. What about what event happened right before they reached the North Pole? Did they cross a barren desert of ice at the Great Polar Ice Cap? Did they travel through the cold, dark wilderness? Or did they drink hot chocolate that was as thick as rich as melted chocolate? What did happen right before they landed the North Pole?
Oh, yes.
Yes. Good job. Good listener.
Yes.
Right. Sometimes we have to listen to the story to find out what for, unfamiliar words. Sometimes,
Listening is very important when
yeah.
we're reading.
Sometimes we get to those hard words and it's okay. But if we can pay attention to the other words called context clues, we can probably figure that word out.
Mm-hmm.
For example, listen to the excerpt from the story. An excerpt is an example from the story. In front of us stood Santa's sleigh. They pranced and paced, ringing silver sleigh bells that hung from their harnesses. It was a magical sound, like nothing I'd ever heard. Listening to that, what do you think the meaning of harnesses is from the excerpt that I just read? They pranced and paced, ringing silver bells that hung from their harnesses. Do you think harness might be a hard plastic siding on the sleigh? Do you think a harness might be the seat of the sleigh? Do you think the harness might be the blades at the bottom of the sleigh? Or do you think it is the set of straps that connected to the animals that are fastened to the sleigh? Do you think? Yes, that is right. What is the clue from the sentence that helped you to figure out what you just said? Yes, they hung on the harnesses. Great job. Good listening. Good searching. And the last question is what we call an open ended race question, where you can explain yourself, making sure that you restate the question, we answer the question, and we make sure we cite that evidence from the book to give the author his props, right? So here's an open ended question. How does the main character change from the beginning to the end of the story in the Polar Express? Use evidence or sentences from the selection to support how the character was at the beginning versus how he was at the end to show how he made a great change at the end of the Polar Express. Thank you, boys and girls, for listening to the Polar Express. And thank you, parents, for listening. Mrs. Claus.
Merry Christmas!